For nearly as long as I can remember, computers have been in my life. Even though I grew up with a Wii and DS, I've always primarily thought of myself as a PC gamer for one simple reason: Steam. If you watched my first public video on this channel, you may know that Portal was the reason I got Steam in the first place, and it was my catalyst for getting into the larger world of PC games outside of Flash sites my grandpa found for me. My introduction to the Half-Life games was rather uninteresting in comparison. In fact, I never bought Half-Life with the intention to play it. In second grade, I got introduced to Gary's Mod by a friend and quickly realized there were missing textures everywhere because I didn't own Counter-Strike Source, and when I went to go buy that on Steam, I discovered that the Valve Complete Pack existed, which is basically a bundle of every game Valve developed on Steam, and it was on sale for $20. Being the little businessman I was, I convinced my mom I should get that instead, since it included the game I needed and a ton of extra stuff for a relatively cheap price. For years to come, I'd completely neglect the Half-Life series in my Steam library because I didn't really know what it was, and I thought Ricochet was more fun for some strange reason. In middle school, however, I'd finally pick up the series since I knew it was connected to Portal in some way, and I already owned it, so I decided I might as well play it. This is a little off topic, but in 7th grade I actually live streamed my first playthrough of Half-Life, and that's when I looked like this. Ignore Michael from Vsauce standing next to me. Over the years, I consistently came back and played these games over and over again, just like I've done with the Portal series, and since I made a retrospective video on that, I decided it would be fun to do one on Half-Life as well. If you know this channel, you can probably guess I'll be going over Half-Life and its expansions alongside my thoughts and some memories from back in the day, and then I'll talk about some of the game's legacy and the popular fan-made content it spawned. Before I actually start, I'm going to quickly mention, however, that this video is only one half of the Half-Life retrospective I have planned. To give myself enough time to go more in-depth with each game in the series without making an exhausting hour-long video like I did last time, I elected to split it into 2 videos, meaning that a video on Half-Life 2 and Alex will be coming at a later date separate to this one. And with that out of the way, let's get into Half-Life. Half-Life opens with the player taking the perspective of Gordon Freeman, a scientist taking his morning commute on an underground railway into the Black Mesa research facility. Before you even get to start really playing the game, it sets the general mood for you while you travel through the vast, technologically advanced yet fragile underground complex and eventually get dropped off at the anomalous materials laboratory for the start of a seemingly average workday. This is the only bit of the game where you can see the world in its natural state, with security personnel and scientists all walking around and tending to their jobs and talking to each other. Freeman dons the Hazardous Environment or HEV suit and prepares for a day of top-secret science-y tests. You make your way to a test chamber where a team of scientists directs you to push a big yellow crystal into the flashy laser beam, and shocker, something goes wrong, and the machinery starts to fall apart before you're teleported into a strange-looking alien world for a brief moment, and then back into the now destroyed test chamber where you first started your workday. Unlike the previous game I covered, that's all you need to know to set up the plot of the game. It's pretty short, and that can be expected from a first-person shooter that launched in 1998. The big laser screw-up you just witnessed is called the Resonance Cascade, the catalyst for all the events in the Half-Life series. The real game starts when you leave this room and venture into the partially destroyed Black Mesa facility, when the player comes across a pair of scientists who inform you that the phone lines are down. You're then tasked with reaching the surface to go get help, giving Freeman his first major objective for the game. This is when you pick up the signature crowbar and a handgun to fight off the first alien enemies that Half-Life has to offer. One of these is the Head Crab, a facehugger-ish alien foe that makes up the lowest level recurring enemy in the series, kinda like Halo's Grunt or even Dragon Quest Slime if you're familiar with those. As the player progresses through different locations in the Black Mesa facility, you encounter more scientists who tell you that the military is arriving to come and save everyone. You solve some basic puzzles to make progress and partake in some downright terrible platforming. Here, Freeman acquires the shotgun and takes on the next tier of enemies, the Vortigaunts, an intelligent bipedal alien species from the world called Zen. These guys are a bit tougher and can shoot ranged attacks at you, but the player's upgraded arsenal keeps them at bay for now. You quickly make progress towards the surface until finally encountering the military personnel sent to save everyone. However, this Hazardous Environment combat unit was sent to Black Mesa with less than good intent. Their true purpose is to kill not only the aliens, but all survivors of the Resonance Cascade as well to cover up the incident. Here, Gordon Freeman hits a bit of a moral speed bump. At this point forward, the only way to survive is to take out the HECU troops using their own weapons against them, tossing machine guns and grenades with questionable physics into the mix. Surprisingly, the player actually reaches the surface quickly after this, although it's in the middle of military bombardment, forcing Freeman back underground where he learns of the Lambda complex on the other side of Black Mesa, where some surviving scientists believe they can close the dimensional rift and reverse the effects of the resonance cascade for good. The sequence that follows this is actually pretty cool and unique in my opinion. The player is dropped into an older sealed-off portion of the Black Mesa facility on your way to the Lambda complex, where you have a sort of boss fight. The player has to solve a few puzzles and try to stay alive in order to incinerate a giant tentacle monster blocking your path with a rocket engine. By today's standards, this is only mildly interesting at best, but for a game from 1998, I think it's a pretty cool break from the formula that Half-Life usually follows. What comes after this blast pit, however, is actually my favorite part of Half-Life, on a rail. It may just be me, but I think this chapter is the most memorable part of the entire game, and it's where the player gets the most freedom of choice and progression, ironically in a segment that is quite literally on rails. In this part of the game, Freeman drives a little cart through the material transport section of Black Mesa. This area is filled with branching paths, HECU soldiers, and various traps that can be dealt with in a multitude of ways. Unlike other parts of the game, you can actually stealth your way through groups of enemies by crouching in your car and making turns in the right places. However, if you want to face the troops, you'll quickly realize this is where the game's difficulty takes a bit of a jump. The HECU soldiers in the military transports tunnels are actually way more prepared than they ever have been before, now with mounted machine gun turrets, rocket launchers, and even sandbag bunkers with snipers inside who can only be taken out with a well-placed grenade. Although some of the difficulty here can easily be boiled down to the sucky physics of the game's primitive engine, it mostly falls on the player to make the right decisions of when to shoot, take cover, or avoid enemies altogether. I do like the on-rails section, but my favorite part of this chapter has to be its conclusion. After fighting through or sneaking past some of the toughest enemies Half-Life has to offer so far, Gordon Freeman reaches the high-altitude launch center, where the player literally gets to shoot a satellite into space to help the Lambda team reverse the effects of the resonance cascade. Half-Life may be a 20-year-old game at this point, but as a space nerd, this bit is always going to be one of the coolest in the game to me. Following on a rail, we get some new enemies and weapons introduced. I really hate to say it, but I just don't like the crossbow in this game. I'm not sure if this is an unpopular opinion or not, but the crossbow in the first Half-Life is just kind of a garbage weapon. In the second game, it's way more useful and cooler conceptually because of the whole glowing rebar thing, but in the first game, it feels like it only exists to kill the alien shark that is introduced alongside, since it's the only ranged weapon that can be used underwater. The other new enemy we come across here are the Black Ops soldiers, basically a more highly trained and dangerous version of the HECU troops you've already fought against. However, these guys only show up briefly in the original Half-Life and take on a more important role in one of the game's expansions. After a bit more of the running and gunning we're used to, Half-Life makes another uncharacteristic break from formula when Gordon Freeman is kidnapped by a couple of HECU soldiers and gets thrown in a trash compactor, in what I'm pretty sure is the game's only actual cutscene. You escape with your life, but the only weapon you get out with is your crowbar, making the newly introduced crossbow feel even more useless since they take it away from you less than an hour after you first acquire it. After getting out of the trash compactor, you realize you're back on the surface again and start heading towards the Lambda complex again. Along the way, Freeman passes through some more visually interesting places like the toxic residue processing plant and a laboratory where some scientists at Black Mesa had been collecting and doing research on some of the Zen aliens before the resonance cascade ripped open the door between worlds. In this facility, you fight some more of the HECU soldiers and regain a sizable portion of your old loadout, even getting a new weapon, the Tau cannon. This gun is one of the best in the game, and you'll be using it against basically every big enemy you come across from this point forwards. The lore behind it is some weird sciencey sounding stuff about particle accelerators and uranium, but all you really need to know is that it does a whole lot of damage. My only real issue with this part of the game is the fact that you have to escort a group of scientists to the exit so they can open the facility's door for you, and the character AI in this game is just really bad. They can never seem to actually follow you without getting stuck on a corner, but this part is only briefly in the original game. Sadly, this NPC following you mechanic gets reused a bit more than I think it should have in the game's expansions, however. This next stretch of the game is Half-Life's penultimate act, starting with the chapter's surface tension, and I know what you're thinking. That was my reaction too when I first played this. That is an ugly-ass skybox. It may look pretty terrible, but surface tension is another kind of unique part of the game, even if it's really short. This is where Freeman gets his hands on the RPG, which is one of the most satisfying weapons in the entire Half-Life series, as the explosive rockets you launch can be directed after firing by the player's reticle. As you continue on your way, we learn that the HECU has begun to call in airstrikes and heavy artillery on Black Mesa as they start to lose the fight against the Xen aliens. This is where the player acquires the original game's only alien weapon, the Hive Hand. It's basically an organic assault rifle with homing shots that automatically regenerate themselves, albeit slowly. The military agents give one last stand against Freeman and they lose, allowing you to finally reach the Lambda complex where some surviving members of the science team inform the player that an immensely powerful being within the border world of Xen is stopping them from reversing the effects of the resonance cascade, meaning you'll have to teleport your way in there and kick its ass yourself. Before you're allowed to go, you can fully replenish your arsenal and HEV suit, and Freeman receives the final and most powerful weapon in the game, the Quantum Destabilizer, and I think that name speaks for itself. Half-Life's final major act takes place in the alien border world of Xen across 4 relatively short chapters. Although the game is widely seen as one of the best shooters of all time, the Xen chapters are usually disliked, and I can definitely see why. When you finally reach the Lambda complex, you feel like you're going to get ready for the final battle, but Xen is more like a long and confusing sequence of lights and sounds with infrequent ammo deposits and a ballsack spider mini-boss that makes the whole thing feel like it overstayed its welcome. Visually, the area is pretty interesting until the novelty wears off and you find yourself hoping the game ends sooner than later. For these reasons, I wanted to keep this section of the video dedicated to Xen relatively short, since in all honesty there's not a ton I feel confident saying about it, aside from the fact that I didn't think it was that good. Xen takes the momentum that the entire game built up on your way to the Lambda complex and kind of runs it into a wall. It's not terrible, but it feels like an unnecessary change of pace for the game that's a bit disappointing. Although, Half-Life's finale at least somewhat makes up for this in my opinion. At the end of Xen lies Half-Life's final boss, Nihilanth. Similar to the tentacles in the blast pit, this boss is another break-in formula for the game that does a pretty good job of being fun and unique without being way too long. The relatively short sequence sees the player destroying the alien's healing crystals on the walls of its chamber, while you escape different rooms full of platforming and enemies that it occasionally teleports you into. When the Nihilanth is fully weakened, its head opens up to reveal a big glowing orb that makes up the creature's brain, giving you one final target to throw all your firepower at before it's defeated, and the resonance cascade can finally be undone by the Lambda team back on Earth. After the Nihilanth is destroyed, you don't teleport back to Earth, however. Instead, Freeman finds himself face to face with the G-Man. I haven't mentioned this character until now because the ending is the first time you actually meet him. Although if you played the game or have a good eye, you might have noticed the fact that this inconspicuous man in a blue suit has been watching you from the sidelines since the very beginning. In the first of many G-Man monologues for the series, he explains how Gordon Freeman's overwhelming power and limitless potential have caught the eye of the G-Man's mysterious employers, who offer Freeman a job. This is an offer you have no choice but to accept. And so the game ends with the G-Man's final words to the player. "Wisely done, Mr. Freeman. I'll see you up ahead." And with that, the credits roll on the first Half-Life. One of the most influential shooters of the 90s, up there with the greats like Quake and Doom, and just like those games, I feel that Half-Life holds up incredibly well in 2021. It doesn't feel outdated at all, and I find it just as fun and well-made feeling as more recent games in the genre, like last year's Doom Eternal. Half-Life does have its subpar moments, and some mechanics that don't feel very good, like the platforming and physics, but for a game from 1998, that can be mostly expected. Half-Life's sequel fixes pretty much all of these problems, though, through the use of Valve's Source engine, which almost all of their games past the original Half-Life are made in. Half-Life itself was even ported to the Source engine later on, which you can play if you want, but many people choose the original because of faster load times. Half-Life originally released in 1998, but it was so popular that Valve published 2 standalone expansions for the game, called Opposing Force and Blue Shift, which were released in 1999 and 2001 respectively. These were both developed by Gearbox Software, who you may know as the creators of Borderlands, another very influential shooter series, this time from the 2000s. Both of these expansions take place at the same time as the main game, but from the perspectives of different people at Black Mesa, giving more context to the story while also adding some new mechanics, weapons, and enemies in there to make a good challenge for those who already played the original. I played both of these for the first time while making this video, so I'll give them the same treatment I did with Half-Life in the order they released. Half-Life Opposing Force stars Corporal Adrian Shepard, one of the HECU soldiers sent into Black Mesa to clean things up. After your helicopter is taken down by alien aircraft in the opening, the player wakes up in an infirmary inside Black Mesa full of members of the science team helping other injured military personnel, obviously unaware that their purpose was to kill all survivors of the incident. We pick up a few unique weapons to the expansion like the combat knife and Desert Eagle, and the player fights Xen aliens as well as the new mysterious Race X, which are a completely new kind of alien foe not seen in the original Half-Life. Near the beginning, we learn over a radio that the HECO is currently evacuating the facility in the middle of a losing battle with the aliens. When we reach the surface, however, Adrian Shepard is left behind by the troops due to interference from the G-Man. You venture back into Black Mesa with the objective of finding your fellow Marines who have been left behind, as well as an alternate escape route from the facility. At an old transit system, we come across other military personnel, the Black Ops soldiers tasked with killing the original HECU troops sent into Black Mesa. A kind of weird situation where the government is essentially trying to cover up a cover-up. The player reaches the Lambda complex and actually witnesses the moment that Gordon Freeman enters Xen at the end of the original game. The player also enters Xen for a short section while trying to get out of the Lambda complex. And there's a brief interlude here between major areas where you for some reason go through an underwater research station. It honestly feels like it's only here to pad out the runtime, but I'll give Gearbox the benefit of the doubt since Opposing Force includes some really interesting locales that don't feel as repetitive as some of the places in the original game. After traveling through Xen again briefly, we reach the Pit Worm's Nest. This boss is very reminiscent of the Blast Pit sequence from the original game. The Pit Worm is an equally cool and memorable section, even if it feels like a recycled concept. Continuing onward, Shepard learns that the Black Ops soldiers we fought earlier are planning to nuke Black Mesa. The player gets a chance to disable the bomb, but later on we can actually see the G-Man secretly reactivating it. There's some cool fights in this section between the Black Ops troops and the Race X aliens, with the player thrown in the mix, and we get a couple more new weapons which are just a sniper rifle and a Doom BFG clone for some reason. Eventually, this leads us to the final boss of Opposing Force, the Gene Worm, a monstrous being trying to come through the portal of the Race X aliens' homeworld. The game concludes with a sequence similar to the original Half-Life, Adrian Shepard being confronted by the G-Man, who shows us Black Mesa being destroyed by the previously mentioned nuclear bomb, before explaining how Adrian will be detained for being a dangerous witness. The G-Man exits the scene through a portal and the credits roll. This expansion, in my honest opinion, is just not that good. The new enemies are a little interesting, but the existence of Race X makes no sense in the context of Half-Life as a whole, since these aliens literally do not show up anywhere outside of Opposing Force, bringing into question the validity of Opposing Force as a part of Half-Life canon. Aside from that, the small arsenal of alien weapons the player can acquire in the later half feel like they only exist to pad out the player's loadout. They all feel pretty useless aside from one gun that can recharge itself, bringing me to the other big issue with Opposing Force. A little while in, the expansion has a major difficulty spike, which is totally fine with the context that you've played the original Half-Life and have experience with the gunplay, but a large part of Opposing Force's difficulty comes from the lack of ammunition across most of the game. There's a lot of large segments where you'll be fighting exclusively alien enemies who don't drop ammo of any kind until you get their specific guns at the end. Maybe I'm not so good at managing ammunition, but even if you landed a headshot every time, I just can't figure out how it would be possible to do this on hard difficulty. You may have noticed sections of the video where I just don't take damage at all, and I'm not afraid to admit that I just kind of turned on God mode and smacked a lot of the aliens to death with a wrench because there was no ammunition to be found. When you get the recharging alien gun near the end of the game, the problem feels like it's only patched up with duct tape, since it takes ages to recharge, meaning you'll be spending half your time in combat sitting in a corner if you've already exhausted all your other supplies. I love Half-Life, and I want to say you should play this expansion, but I have a really hard time recommending Opposing Force unless you're a die-hard fan. On the other hand, Gearbox's later edition of the Half-Life series fares much better by today's standards in my opinion. Half-Life Blue Shift was released a little while later in 2001, and it follows Barney Calhoun, a security guard at Black Mesa during the events of the Resonance Cascade. In the opening sequence, we get to take another ride through the underground train at Black Mesa, which shows off a few new, previously unseen bits. This is off topic, but I really like that this exists just because it builds more of the atmosphere and breathes a bit of life into the game's world. When we reach the end of our trip, we can actually see Gordon Freeman pass us on another train car, mirroring the beginning of the original game, where the player can see a security guard waiting to be led into a door on the side of a tunnel. Next is another sequence that I personally really like. As Calhoun's workday starts before the events of the Resonance Cascade, we get to see another small glimpse into the world of Black Mesa in its original state. It might just be me, but segments like this are some of my favorite moments in the whole series. Moving on, you're tasked with helping some scientists with an elevator. This is when the Resonance Cascade happens, leading to the elevator you're in snapping from its cable and falling to the bottom of the shaft. After waking up, you find out about the Zen aliens attacking the facility, as well as the military sent in to kill survivors and cover up the incident. Blue Shift has the player only encountering weapons and enemies that were also featured in the first Half-Life. Because of that, I think it's probably a better starting point for people who liked Half-Life and want to try the expansions. Calhoun makes his way through the facility looking for help and rescues Dr. Rosenberg, who explains the only way to escape Black Mesa is through an abandoned prototype teleporter. One thing you really start to notice in this expansion is that so many of the puzzles are based around physics and breaking objects in the environment. It gets used way more than in the original game, but for something from 2001, it's definitely pretty cool and makes Blue Shift feel slightly unique compared to Half-Life's first campaign. Upon reaching the old teleporter in the depths of Black Mesa, Calhoun is sent into Zen to activate a device that'll make the teleportation work. If you played the whole Half-Life 1 library, it might feel exhausting to return to Zen again, but this part is relatively short and we do get to see the remains of a human research camp in the border world, which is an interesting set piece. When you return back to the team of scientists, you're tasked again with fixing up the teleporter, this time fighting through HECU troops and Zen aliens to get some batteries recharged so the teleporter can stay on long enough for everyone to get out. Once it's fully operational, the final sequence of Blue Shift begins, where the player operates the teleporter for the science team to get out. Once everyone besides the player has escaped, military agents storm the room, putting up one last fight before Barney Calhoun jumps into the teleporter's orange orb and meets the rest of the science team safely outside of Black Mesa. For a brief moment, you're teleported away to witness the kidnapping of Gordon Freeman in the chapter Apprehension of the original game, but Calhoun quickly reappears alongside Dr. Rosenberg and some of his co-workers, where the gate is finally opened, allowing them to escape the facility. Blue Shift ends here in a bit of a unique fashion. No G-Man anywhere to be found, and Barney Calhoun successfully escapes with his life, no strings attached. Blue Shift is easily my favorite expansion out of the two, as it doesn't introduce any new confusing new plot points or enemies and is much shorter. It still retains the feel of the original game without being too wildly different like Opposing Force was. The difficulty spike I mentioned in the last expansion is still present, but it doesn't feel unfair at any point. The escorting missions are still a mild pain in the ass like before, but I genuinely think this is a must-play for anyone who liked Half-Life, even if you don't want to play Opposing Force alongside it. Blue Shift is also more important to the series from a lore standpoint, as Barney Calhoun does end up being an important character in Half-Life 2. Both of Half-Life's expansions are good additions, but if you were to only play one, I'd have to recommend Blue Shift for these reasons. For the die-hard fans, however, who played both Opposing Force and Blue Shift, there's actually another Half-Life expansion you may not even be aware of. Something you may not know about Half-Life is that it also released on the PlayStation 2 in later 2001, including a third expansion made by Gearbox, Half-Life Decay. What's unique about Decay is that it was designed for split-screen co-op gameplay, with the two players taking the roles of Dr. Cross and Dr. Green, two of Freeman's co-workers at Black Mesa. I can't say much on the gameplay and story, however Decay does include the appearance of Dr. Rosenberg from Blue Shift. Throughout the game, the two players fight against human and Zen enemies we already know from the original. The campaign consists of multiple missions, where the players complete tasks mirroring the events of Half-Life, like sending up the crystal sample to Freeman that started the Resonance Cascade, and preparing the rocket that you launch at the end of the chapter on a rail. There's even a bonus mission where you get to play as a pair of Vortigaunts. I haven't been able to play the full thing since this is the only Half-Life game never released on PC, but some fans ported it themselves with included online support. You can also play the whole thing yourself if you want, but you have to constantly switch between characters, which can get pretty tedious and make things more difficult. Overall, Half-Life Decay is an interesting piece of Valve history that gets left out of discussion of Half-Life far too often. And with that, we're done talking about the games released in the Half-Life 1 anthology. All of the Half-Life expansions hold up today just as well as the main game, and I recommend playing them if you get the chance. But for now, I want to move on to talking about the impact Half-Life has had on the world of PC games in the past 20 years, and more specifically, how much the modding community has thrived through the series. If you're watching this, it's almost guaranteed that you know about Half-Life's success. According to Gabe Newell, the game was only expected to sell around 180,000 copies, but by only 2008 it managed to sell over 9 million. This, alongside the game's almost universal 5-star rating among reviewers, has made Half-Life, Valve, and Steam probably some of the first things you think of when PC gaming is mentioned. And one of the biggest reasons that is because of Valve's encouragement of fan-made content and mods. If you were around for the beginning of this channel, you probably remember me listing off a highlight reel of all the great Portal mods I remember playing growing up. And Half-Life is where this legacy of fan-made content in Valve games began. Half-Life was developed in Valve's in-house game engine called Gold Source, which is actually a modified version of id Software's Quake engine. Half-Life's retail release actually included a level design tool used for the making of the game, and later on an entire software development kit was released to the masses, allowing anybody with the knowledge and dedication to build their own games on the foundation of Half-Life. To promote this SDK, Valve developed and released Team Fortress Classic, a port of a Quake mod and predecessor to the more widely known and successful game Team Fortress 2. Yeah, Team Fortress 2 is based on a Half-Life port of a Quake mod, and it's one of the most well-known online PC games made to date. It even went free-to-play years after releasing, meaning anyone with a decent graphics card can make a Steam account and play it right now completely free of charge. Back on the topic of actual fan-created mods for Half-Life, some of the notable ones include Day of Defeat and Counter-Strike. And this is what, in my opinion, makes Valve just an amazing developer. Both of these games were independently created as mods for Half-Life, but Valve liked them both so much that they helped the modders release them as full retail games under the Half-Life name. That's right, Counter-Strike was a fan-made mod that Valve liked so much they turned it into another one of the largest PC game franchises of all time. The decision to pick up Counter-Strike and publish it would lead to one of the biggest competitive scenes in all of gaming through the series' most recent release, Counter-Strike Global Offensive. That's not even where it ends though. CSGO also recently went free-to-play, meaning Half-Life mods led to not one but two of some of the most popular online PC games of all time, both of which are completely free through Steam. It might seem like I'm fanboying right now, and I am, but the legacy of Half-Life is really, really impressive for Valve. A game that expected to sell less than 200,000 copies gave them an almost complete monopoly on the PC game market, without even mentioning the rest of the series. And believe me, Half-Life 2 has some mods just as influential as these, which are probably going to make the second part of this series drag on way longer than this one. The way I want to conclude this retrospective on the first Half-Life is with something I actually haven't had the chance to play at all, but I really want to in the near future, and that is Black Mesa. Black Mesa is an entire remake of the first Half-Life from the people over at Crowbar Collective, and it's probably one of the most good-looking things you'll ever see in the Source engine. In 2005, Valve released Half-Life Source, which was a re-release of the original game in the Source engine, Valve's successor to Gold Source. Most people expected Half-Life Source to be some kind of HD remaster, but it was instead more of a lazy port, retaining everything from the original but the base physics engine. Since then, Crowbar Collective was formed out of two teams working towards the same goal, to create the Half-Life remaster that Valve never did. And last year, because of all their hard work and dedication, the full version of Black Mesa was officially released on Steam, endorsed by Valve themselves. I already said I haven't played Black Mesa yet, which feels like a crime on its own, but I've watched countless videos on the game, and it's one of the most impressive things to come out of the Half-Life franchise in my opinion. I think the best part of Black Mesa is how Zen was handled. In the original game, the Zen chapters felt like an hour-long snore fest, a kind of boring segment that made the game's ending feel like it wasn't as good as it could have been. But in Black Mesa, Zen is reimagined with new and expanded levels as well as some incredibly good-looking scenery. Again, it feels almost wrong to talk about the game without even playing it, but it's something I'll be getting to very soon because it is quite literally the most definitive version of Half-Life for a modern audience. Overall, the original Half-Life and its expansions are still great games with a ton of history attached to them. If you haven't played the series at all, you can get it on Steam for an insanely low price every time there's a winter or summer sale on the platform. Even if it took me until middle school to actually start playing Half-Life, I still have so many great memories with these games, and I'm really glad I got to put this together as a little tribute to the first one in the series. As you probably already know, this is only the first half of my retrospective on the Half-Life series, so I'll shamelessly plug my own channel at the end and suggest that you subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be some of the first people to know when my video on Half-Life 2 and Alyx comes out later in the month. And if you want something else to watch in the meantime, I'll put up a card right now for my Portal series retrospective, which might be briefly referenced in the lore bit of the next video. And with that out of the way, I'll be seeing you in part 2. Thank you.